All right. Shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I would like to give all praise and glory to YAHAWAH, BAHASHAM, YAHAWASHI, BAHASHAM, Rakakwadash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone that taught us this truth. And salutations to the hopeful elect that's around the four corners of the globe. And the elect begins with the 144,000. YAHAWAH, who the world ignorantly calls God and Jehovah, BAHASHAM is in the name. YAHAWASHI, who the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ. The Rakakwadash, which is the Holy Spirit. I'm the brother Iwan Lumia with the gym at Chicago camp out here in Chicago. Come back at you brothers and sisters at a household of faith of the Hopeful Right Select with another lesson. And Lord willing, I hope this lesson be edifying through the spirit and power of Yahawah Shai. Once again, I hope this lesson is edifying, to the Hopeful Right Select. But I'm gonna just just really going to the chapters of or the chapter of Wisdom of Solomon, the fifth chapter, primarily verses 1 through 3, man. And, just something I was meditating on, really going into, the strangers of our salvation, man. How ultimately we're going to be beamed up by the chariots, and it's going to seem strange, to the heathen, the wicked of all people that's ultimately going to watch the elect being beamed up. It's going to be a sight to see for the rest of these people, man. How we're ultimately going to be changed, man. The Lord is going to give us those new bodies as we're being beamed up into those chariots, man. But really breaking down the first 3 verses of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. But let's get into it. This is the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 5, and verse 1. Then shall the righteous man stand in great boldness before the face of such as have afflicted him, and made no account of his labors. Right, and this devil had made no account of of our labors, man. Labors, because you have the so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans that ultimately built up America, man. The different inventions, things of that nature, man. We ultimately built up this man's kingdom, man. Esau's Edom's kingdom, through hardcore labor, man. Ultimately the different inventions that ultimately Jake created, to ultimately to build this man's kingdom up. Read that again. Wisdom Solomon chapter 5, verse 1. Then shall the righteous man stand in great boldness. And right, we're standing in great boldness, man. Telling this devil in front of his face that he is going down. Because it talks about we shall prophesy against Mount Seir. And that's what we're doing in these times, man. Going back to, prior to like 1969, when this truth, became mainstream in 1970. Hey, ultimately what? When we was happen to teach, in the early 1900s, man, we would be lynched for teaching this word, man. But the Lord has made it in a way that, well, what? We're teaching this word in great boldness, man. Let me actually grab a precept real quick. This is the book of Proverbs 28:1. And it reads, the wicked flee when no man pursueth, but the righteous are as bold as a lion. Right? The Lord put the spirit on us to ultimately to teach this word in great boldness, man. Telling this devil in front of his face that his kingdom is going down, man. That it's nothing that he can do about it, man. And it's nothing that this devil can do about it, man. He's ultimately trying different things to ultimately to try to shut down the truth, but it's to no avail, man. So we're ultimately proclaiming this truth in great boldness, man. So I'm gonna read it again. Wisdom Solomon 5, verse 1. It says, then shall the righteous man stand in great boldness, and that's what the prophets are doing. The true prophets of YAHAWASHI Shai is preaching this word in great boldness, telling this devil in front of his face that he's going down, man. Before the face of such as have afflicted him and made no account of his labors, right? Like I mentioned before, Esau Edom, downplays, the different inventions, different attributes that, Jake had, contributed towards his society, man. The hardcore slavery, that we was made to serve is ultimately, is downplayed, man. This devil made no account of our labors, man. The different inventions that Jake ultimately made, to benefit this man's kingdom, man. Ultimately is downplayed, man. It says, verse 2, it says, when they see it, they shall be troubled with terrible fear, and shall be amazed at the strangers of his salvation, so far beyond all that they look for. Right? What is the strangers of our salvation, man? Us being beamed up into what the world would ignorantly call a UFO, man. The chariots of YAHAWASHI, which we're going to be beamed up, and the hopeful rights of life is going to be beamed up into those chariots, man. Let's actually grab this real quick. Because you got to understand also, man, that we're going to be changing the twinkling of an eye, man. And it's going to seem strange to the rest of these people that's witnessing what? The elect being beamed up. But why the world will ignorantly call a UFO, man, which is the chariots of YAHAWASHI Shai. Let me actually grab this real quick. In Revelations. And there's a few I'm gonna get regarding that that verse. Bear with me for a second. This is Revelations 18. Yep, Revelations 18 and verse 4. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. All right, how are we ultimately gonna, escape the swords of America, man? By the way of the chariots, man. What the world will ignorantly call UFOs, man. You know, the angels are gonna what? Be on those chariots, delivering the elect, man. You know, and that's how we're gonna be delivered from the swords of America, man. That's the strangest of our salvation. Let's actually grab this also. I believe it's in First Thessalonians, because we're going to be changed, man, in the twinkling of an eye. Let's actually grab that real quick before I go to that one. Let's see. First Corinthians 15 and verse 50. And it reads, now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of Yahawah, neither does corruption inherit incorruption. Right. So ultimately, what we're going to be changed from this defiled flesh that we're currently in, man. It says, verse 51. It says, behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. When it says not all sleep, man, well, we're not going to all perish. We're not going to all die, man. It says, but we shall all be changed. And how we're going to be changed, man? By the Lord, what? YAHAWASHI, changing our corruptible bodies, to an incorruptible body, man. We're not going to sin. Once the chariots ultimately beam us up, we're going to be changed. It's going to go into it. Verse 52, it says, in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, for the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. So ultimately, what? We're going to be changed out of these corruptible bodies, man. When that light flashes on us, man, and we be beamed up into those chariots, we're going to change in the twinkling of an eye, man. That's a part of the strangers of our salvation, man. You know? Read that again. Verse 52, it says, in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, for the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed, right? Because those that, ultimately, died in this truth, they're going to be the first ones risen, man. And ultimately, to be what? To be the first ones changed. Verse 53, it says, for this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. Ultimately, what? We're going to have bodies that's not going to sin. We're going to have bodies that's not going to, not going to go off. We're going to be immortal. That entails, the strangers of our salvation, man. We're going to be changed. You know, verse 53, also like in verse 54, it says, so when this corruptible shall put on incorruption, and this mortal shall put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. Meaning what? We're going to be immortal, man. We're going to overcome death. And that's a part of the strangers of our salvation, man, because when we be beamed up into those chariots, man, we're going to be changed. As I read in verse 52, in the twinkling of an eye, man. It's going to be a sight to see for the rest of these people, man. You know, these heathen, beginning with these Edomites, the 2/3 of all wicked people. It's going to be a sight to see for them, man. When they see ultimately what the world will ignorantly call UFOs, which are the chariots of YAHAWASHI, beaming up the elect, man, of the nation of Israel. You know, it's going to be a sight to see, for them, you know, and that's a part of the strangers of our salvation, us being changed in the twinkling of an eye, man, us being what? Given those new bodies, us being beamed up into those chariots, man. You know, let's grab another one. Bear with me for a second. Let me grab this one in First Thessalonians. This is the book of First Thessalonians 4 and verse 15. For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent them which are asleep. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of Yahawah, and the dead and Mashiach shall rise first. Because like I mentioned before, ultimately those individuals that died, being in this truth, teaching this word, they're going to be the first ones risen, man. They're going to be the first ones beamed up and changed, man. It says, verse 17, then which we are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them. And the clouds, and right, the clouds are what? Represents the chariots, man. Because it talks about in Revelation, the Lord coming with clouds and every eye shall see him, loosely paraphrasing. It says, verse 17, it says, then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them and the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord, YAHAWAH, BAHASHAM, YAHAWASHI, right? We're going to meet the Lord in the air, man. We're going to meet the Lord what? In that chariot, man. It talks about we shall be like him, I believe that's, is that First John, if I'm not mistaken? Let me see. And this all entails the strangers of our salvation, man. Let me see, I believe it's First John, if I'm not mistaken. Yep, First John 3 and verse, I'm going to start at verse 1. First John 3 and 1, it says, behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we shall be called the sons of Yahawah. Therefore the world knoweth us not, because it knew him not. Beloved, now are we the sons of Yahawah, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And exactly right, man. And ultimately, Yahawah, BAHASHAM, YAHAWASHI, Yahawashi is in his full glory, man, his ultimate glory, man. Because it talks about, the Lord is not going to meet thee as a man, man. Yahawashi is in his ultimate glory, man. You know, and ultimately, what we shall, see him as he is, man. We shall be like him. What we're going to have those new bodies, man. We're not going to sin. Once we, as I read in that 1 Corinthians 15, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, we shall be changed. So we're going to have those new bodies. That's a part of the strangers of our salvation, man. The world witnessing what the elect being, the elect of the nation of Israel being beamed up into what the world would ignorantly call UFOs, being changed, man, in the twinkling of an eye, man, being beamed up into the chariots. That entails the strangers of our salvation, man. Let's actually grab one more. It's that first Isaiah 26 and 20. Let's see. Yep, this is the book of Isaiah 26 and 20. Come, my people, enter thou into thy chambers and shut thy doors about thee. Hide thyself as it were for a little moment until the indignation be overpassed, right? The elect being beamed up into those chariots, ultimately what? To escape the thermonuclear destruction that's to come upon this place, Babylon the Great, man. Because what? It talks about the great earthquake in Isaiah 24, and what? The Lord is going to beam up his hopeful right select into those chariots, to escape the destruction, man. But let's go back to that wisdom of Solomon. All this, like I mentioned before, entails the strangers of our salvation, man. Us being beamed up into those chariots, us being changed in the twinkling of an eye, you know. But let's go ahead and finish out this wisdom of Solomon. Bear with me. Go grab it. Just had it. Wisdom of Solomon 5, Salakia. Wisdom of Solomon 5 and verse 3 to finish it out. Wisdom of Solomon 5 and 3. And they repenting and groaning for anguish of spirit shall say within themselves, right? The other nations, ultimately what? Looking at the elect being beamed up, this is what they're going to say to themselves, even the wicked of our people, man. It says, and they repenting and groaning for anguish of spirit shall say within themselves, this is he whom we had sometimes in derision and a proverb and a proverb of reproach. And right, because ultimately these other nations think very little of our people, man. They think very little of our people because it talks about thou shalt be a proverb and a byword, man. That's, in the curses of Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter, man. We shall be a proverb and a byword amongst all nations, man. Let's read this Lamentations real quick because this is what they feel about our people, man. I believe it's Lamentations. Let me see. Lamentations 2. Oh, let me find it real quick. This is the book of Lamentations 2 and verse 15. All that pass by clap their hands at thee. They hiss and wag their head at the daughters of Jerusalem, saying, is this the city that men call the perfection of beauty, the joy of the whole earth? All thine enemies, verse 16, all thine enemies have opened their mouth against thee. They hiss and gnash the teeth. They say, we have swallowed her up. Certainly, this is the day that we look for. We have found, we have seen it. And ultimately, what? These heathens ultimately what? Basically destroying our people, man. Ultimately our people being a proverb and a bad word amongst these other nations, man. Our people being belittled and downtrodden amongst these other nations. Ultimately what? Us being the bottom of the barrel, essentially, man. Us being the butt of every joke, But let's go back to this Wisdom of Solomon. I'm gonna read verse 4 also. Wisdom of Solomon 5 and verse 4. It says, we fools account his light madness and his end to be without honor. And right, this is ultimately what the rest of the nations think about our people, man. Like I mentioned before, the butt of every joke, ultimately, the proverbs, the bad words, niggers, spicks, so ultimately when we being, getting seen beamed up, the hopeful rights like being seen beamed up, this is what they're gonna say within themselves, man. These niggers, they were the chosen people of YAHAWASHI this whole time, and Lord willing, we be a part of that number, man. But ultimately what? This is what entails the strangers of our salvation, man. Us being ultimately what? Being changed in the twinkling of an eye. The whole world ultimately witnessing what? The elect of the nation of Israel getting beamed up at what the world will ignorantly call UFOs, which are the chariots of YAHAWASHI. This is what the strangers of our salvation entails, man. Hey, which is coming very soon, man. But just something I wanted to get into real quick. Lord, I hope this lesson was edifying. Lord, want to come back at you with some more soon, Lord willing. But I want to end up by giving all praise, honor, and glory to YAHAWAH, BAHASHAM, YAHAWASHI, BAHASHAM, Makakwadash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of great millstone who taught us the truth. And salutations to the hopeful elect that's around the four corners of the globe. Lord willing, I hope this lesson was edifying. Till next time, Kwame Yasharala, Shalom, and the Bible Ball. Until next time, Lord willing.